June 3rd, 1943. Adak Island, territory of Alaska. The Japanese soldiers had been promised a glorious death battling for the emperor on the sacred soil of the Aleutians. They found themselves staring at a movie screen. 21-year-old Haicho Kenji Tanaka, a survivor of the annihilated 303rd Independent Infantry Battalion from Attu, could not process the sight. The wool of the American-issued blanket felt coarse against his skin, a humiliating comfort in the face of the impossible. He and the 24 other prisoners huddled in a transport truck, their chains clinking softly with the vehicle's vibrations, their collective gaze fixed on the apparition. Fog. Endless fog. A wall of white that swallowed sound and sight, clinging to everything with a damp, bone-deep chill. This was the world they knew, the world of the Williwaw wind and the volcanic rock. A world of grim survival. But through the mist, something flickered. A light where no light should be. The whispers had started in the holding pens. Whispers of impossible things. Someone said the Americans had built a city out of the ice. Another claimed to have heard music, not marches, but strange swinging rhythms that echoed over the tundra. Rumors always existed, but this was no rumor. This was a vision. A massive wooden structure, its entrance framed by lights that cut through the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows. Men, their enemies, were laughing. They were lining up, not for battle, not for rations, but for something else. Something frivolous. It was, one of the American guards had explained with a casualness that felt like a physical blow, the ice theater. A place for entertainment. Entertainment. The word was an obscenity here, in this frozen hell 1,000 miles from anywhere meaningful. They were prisoners of war, the dishonored remnants of a suicidal defense. Their comrades lay frozen in the mud of Attu, their bodies contorted from banzai charges and self-inflicted grenade blasts. They had fought with bayonets and spiritual strength against an avalanche of steel. They had chosen death over capture. And the Americans, the architects of that avalanche, were watching movies. It was not the defeat that finally broke them. It was not the capture, nor the cold, nor the hunger. It was the disbelief. A profound, soul-shattering disbelief that such a thing could exist in such a place. The interrogation transcripts, filed under the starkly bureaucratic codename Aleutian Morale Study, Appendix B, noted a recurring anomaly among the Attu captives. A state of detachment, a psychological paralysis. The report stated, subjects exhibit a fixation on non-military infrastructure, specifically recreational facilities. They struggle to reconcile the enemy's logistical capacity for leisure with the operational environment. These men, trained for a war of attrition and spirit, were confronted with an enemy that could project not just overwhelming force, but overwhelming normality into the most inhospitable corner of the globe. Why did this spectacle of Western abundance, erected amidst the brutal machinery of war, have such a devastating impact? What did they see in that casual display that their own fanatical doctrine could not explain? The story of the Aleutian Campaign is often told as a footnote to the Pacific War, a bizarre sideshow fought in fog and ice. But the true secret of the frozen island is not found in battle reports or strategic maps. It lies buried in the stunned silence of those prisoners, in the ghostly glow of the American ice theater, and in the moment they understood they were not just fighting an army, but a civilization they could never comprehend. May 16th, 1944, Hancock County, Iowa. The letter was thin, crinkled paper that felt of salt and distance. Private John Miller, formerly of Route 2, now of APO 948, wrote about the fog. He wrote about the wind. A wind they called the Williwaw, a fist of God that could tear a tent from its moorings and send a man flying into the gray, churning sea. He wrote little else. Nobody in Iowa understood. Nobody could picture it. A war fought in the fog. In Washington, D.C., they understood perfectly. In a windowless room deep within the Department of War, a man named Colonel Harrison stared at a map. It wasn't a map of Europe with its familiar contours of France and Germany. It wasn't even the sun-drenched map of the South Pacific, with Guadalcanal and Tarawa circled in red grease pencil. This map was different. This map was a secret. The folder was called Project Sundown, a deceptively peaceful name. Inside, the chart showed a long, curving spine of volcanic rock and tundra arcing across the top of the world. The Aleutian Islands. A name that sounded like a mistake, a mispronunciation. To most Americans, it was a blank space, a geographical afterthought. To Colonel Harrison, it was the most important place on Earth. Look at the globe. That's what he told the junior officers. Don't look at the flat Mercator projection, it lies to you. Look at the globe. Put your finger on Seattle, now put another on Tokyo. The shortest line between them, the Great Circle Route, doesn't cross the sunny emptiness of the Central Pacific. It arcs north. It runs right alongside the Aleutians, a highway of water and air. The fastest way to get from America to Japan. The fastest way to get from Japan to America. A dagger. A two-way dagger. That's what the report stated. The islands were a chain of unsinkable aircraft carriers, a string of pearls leading from the Alaskan mainland almost to the shores of Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula. From there, it was a short hop to the Kuril Islands. Japan's northern gate. Control the Aleutians, and you could project power deep into the enemy's homeland. You could launch bombers. You could stage fleets. You could sever their northern supply lines. Schneider, Becker, Wagner, Kaufmann. The names on the planning committee were as American as apple pie, but the strategy was as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. And the Japanese knew it. They knew it all along. The whispers started in the spring of 1942. Signals intelligence, the codebreakers of Station Hypo, picked up chatter. Chatter about a northern area fleet, about an operation designated AL. Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya. His fleet was small, but its target was immense. The Americans thought it was a diversion, a feint to draw Admiral Nimitz's carriers away from the main event. The main event was Midway. Everyone knew Midway was the prize. But was it only a diversion? Was it? The map on Harrison's wall told a different story. The Aleutians were more than a diversion. They were a prize in their own right. A prize worth fighting for, bleeding for, dying for in the freezing mud. For the Japanese, they were a buffer, a shield. Seize the western Aleutians, Attu, Kiska, Adak, and you create a defensive perimeter that stretches halfway across the Pacific. No American B-17s could reach Tokyo from there. No American fleet could sneak north to surprise the homeland. It was a lock on the back door. A very important lock. But there was more. The analyst in the windowless room saw something else. Something colder. The Japanese weren't just thinking of defense. They were thinking of offense. Dutch Harbor, on the island of Unalaska, a major American naval base. From Kiska, it was just 650 miles away. An easy bombing run. From Dutch Harbor, it was a straight shot to Anchorage, to Seward, to the Alaskan mainland. And from there, Seattle, Portland. The Boeing factories that built the flying fortresses. The shipyards that birthed the Liberty ships. The entire industrial heart of the American West Coast. It was suddenly very real, not a theory, not a war game on a board. The islands themselves were a special kind of hell. There were no palm trees, no white sand beaches. There was rock, there was mud. There was the constant, soul-crushing fog that could reduce visibility to 5 feet. 5 feet. Imagine flying a plane through that. Imagine trying to find an enemy ship. The weather was the Third Army in the fight. An army that never slept. An army that fought for both sides and for neither. The Japanese took Attu and Kiska in June of 1942. Just days after the Battle of Midway, while America celebrated its great victory in the Central Pacific, the enemy had landed on American soil, the first time since the War of 1812. It was a fact so shocking, so humiliating, that the government tried to keep it quiet. They whispered about it in the halls of power. Rumors circulated in the press rooms. But the truth was there. Imperial Japanese soldiers were digging in on territory that belonged to the United States of America. For a year they stayed there, digging tunnels into the frozen earth of Kiska, building airstrips on the barren shores of Attu. They were waiting, they were fortifying. The map in Harrison's room gained a new, ugly mark, a splash of red on the westernmost tip of the chain. A stain. He would stare at it for hours, the cigar smoke coiling around his head like the Aleutian fog itself. Protecting Alaska was one thing. Supporting the Lend-Lease route to the Soviet Union through Alaska was another. Both were critical. Absolutely critical. But this was different. This was about pride. This was about sovereignty. This was about the dagger the Japanese held the hilt. And it was pointed directly at the heart of America. Something had to be done. A decision was made in that quiet, smoke-filled room. A decision that would send thousands of boys like John Miller from places like Hancock County, Iowa, into a meat grinder of fog, ice, and Japanese machine guns. The cost would be high. The planners knew the cost. But the islands had to be retaken. Every single one. Attu, Kiska, Agatu, Shemya, Amchitka. The red stain on the map had to be erased, no matter what. June 3rd, 1942, North Pacific Ocean. The fog was an accomplice. It clung to the steel hulls of the carriers, a cold, wet shroud hiding them from the world. No one saw them coming. Not the fishing boats, not the patrol planes, not the watchers on the lonely shores. Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta stood on the bridge of the light carrier Ryujo, a ghost ship sailing through a sea of milk-white vapor alongside her sister, the Junyo. He was invisible. His fleet was invisible. The Americans would never see them. The Northern Area Fleet, a formidable collection of 2 carriers, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 destroyers, and support vessels, sliced through the gray water. Their orders were simple, brutal. Attack the American naval base at Dutch Harbor on Amaknak Island. The pilots were briefed in rooms thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of engine oil. They looked at maps of a place most had never heard of, a dot on the edge of the world. Dutch Harbor, not Dutch at all. The name was a corruption. Just like the American presence here was a corruption of the natural order. Or so they were told. The briefing officer's voice was a low drone. The targets were clear. The fuel depot, the barracks, the radio station. Cripple the base, sow confusion, frighten the Americans. The first Koku Sentai, the same elite air fleet that had shattered Pearl Harbor, was now hundreds of miles to the south, preparing for the main event. This was just the prelude, the opening act, a diversion. It was all a diversion. The Zeros and Kate bombers lifted off the decks of the Ryujo and Junyo into the icy Alaskan morning. The roar of their Nakajima Sakai engines was swallowed by the immense empty sky. They flew low, following the jagged coastline of Umnak Island, their canopies beaded with condensation. Below them, a landscape of impossible green and volcanic black, a place that felt older than time. The pilots were young. 20-year-old Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga gripped his controls, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had bombed Hawaii. This felt different. Colder, wilder. The air itself felt alien. Then they saw it. Dutch Harbor. A small, ugly scar of civilization nestled in a deep bay. A handful of ships in the harbor. Rows of Quonset huts. The giant oil tanks, fat and silver, gleaming even in the dull light. It looked small, vulnerable. The first bombs fell at 5:45 in the morning. They missed the oil tanks. A stroke of luck for the Americans. A moment of frustration for the Japanese pilots. But they hit the barracks of the 307th Infantry at Fort Mears. They hit the docks. They strafed buildings, their machine guns chattering a message of violence across the quiet bay. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Men died in their bunks. Nobody expected it. Not really. Rumors had existed, of course. Whispers in Washington. Maybe from naval intelligence? Maybe from command trips to Alaska. But on the ground, life had a sleepy, peacetime rhythm. The attack was a brutal awakening. Sirens screamed. Anti-aircraft guns coughed to life, their black puffs of smoke smudging the gray sky. A handful of American P-40 Warhawk fighters from the 11th Air Force scrambled into the air from a hidden airfield on Umnak, racing to meet the attackers. A dogfight erupted over the frigid waters, a clash of machines and men in a place that seemed to want neither. The Japanese planes returned to their carriers. The next day, June 4th, they came back. This time they knew where to aim. They hit the oil tanks, sending thick black pillars of smoke into the sky, a funeral pyre visible for 100 miles. They hit a hospital. They bombed the old Russian Orthodox church, its onion dome a strange and exotic silhouette against the flames. They destroyed a barracks ship, the Northwestern. The attack was more precise, more vicious. It was a statement. We can reach you, we can touch you. Anywhere. But the bombing was a lie, a magnificent, violent deception. The real objective was 200 miles further west, out on the thin, windswept tail of the Aleutian chain. The file in Tokyo was called Operation AL. The plan was not just to bomb, but to take, to occupy, to plant the flag of the rising sun on North American soil. The strategic goal, as conceived by the Imperial General Headquarters, was to draw the American Pacific Fleet north, lure Admiral Nimitz's precious carriers away from the Central Pacific, away from the real prize. A tiny atoll called Midway, split their forces, confuse their command. That was the theory. That was the grand design of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. A feint to the north, a knockout blow in the center. They chose two islands, Attu and Kiska, names that sounded like a cough. Bleak, treeless, windswept rocks pounded by the Bering Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Home to birds, sea lions, and a constant soul-crushing fog. On June 6, 1942, while the smoke still cleared over Dutch Harbor and the American fleet was locked in a death struggle at Midway, the Japanese landed on Kiska, 500 Marines of the Special Naval Landing Force. They came ashore in the dense fog, their movements silent, ghostly. They expected a fight. They brought machine guns, mortars, field artillery. They found an abandoned American weather station. 10 men. 9 had been evacuated. The 10th, a meteorologist named William C. House, was taken prisoner. That was the entire defending force. One man. The next day, June 7th, it was Attu's turn. The North Sea Detachment, an army unit under Major Matsutoshi Hozumi, landed in Holtz Bay. Around 1,200 men. Again, the fog provided perfect cover. They moved inland through the wet tundra and ankle-deep mud, their boots making sucking sounds in the silence. They found a village, a small collection of wooden houses. In the village lived 42 Unangan people, the native Aleut's and one American couple. Charles Foster Jones, aged 60, an amateur radio operator and weather observer. His wife, Etta, aged 62, a schoolteacher and nurse. The Japanese soldiers surrounded their small house. Charles Jones had been radioing warnings to Dutch Harbor for days. Frantic messages about strange ships, strange planes. Now the source of the signals had arrived on his doorstep. He destroyed his radio equipment, a final act of defiance. He and his wife were taken prisoner. The Aleut villagers were herded together. Their lives, their world, had been irrevocably broken. Etta Jones would die in a prison camp in Yokohama. Charles Jones would die in a camp in Hokkaido. The Aleuts would be shipped to Japan as laborers. Their village on Attu was erased. The Japanese had done it. They had invaded America. It was an occupation without a battle, a conquest whispered in the fog. On Kiska, they raised their flag. On Attu, they began building fortifications, digging into the frozen earth. The news, when it finally trickled back to the mainland, was a profound shock. A psychological blow far greater than the military significance of the islands themselves. Japanese soldiers were on American soil, not a territory, not a protectorate. American soil. It was an insult, a stain. The grand diversion, however, had failed. Completely. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked JN-25, the Japanese naval code. They knew about Midway. They knew AF was Midway, not the Aleutians. Nimitz refused to take the bait. He sent a small task force north, just enough to show the flag, but kept his main carrier groups south for the decisive battle. The Japanese Northern Area Fleet had bombed a secondary target and occupied two worthless islands, all while their comrades in the south sailed into a catastrophic ambush. The carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all gone. The backbone of the Japanese Navy broken. But the soldiers on Attu and Kiska did not know this. Not yet. They were busy, digging trenches, setting up gun emplacements, preparing for the American counterattack they knew must come. They were alone at the far end of a long and tenuous supply line on a piece of land that God himself seemed to have forgotten. The fog rolled in, thick and permanent, hiding them from the sky, hiding them from the sea, but it could not hide them from the future. The invasion had been easy. The occupation was a reality. And now the main thing started, the long, brutal wait for the Americans to come and take their islands back. May 29, 1943. Attu Island, Aleutian Islands. They had not been trained for this, not for this place. The soldiers of the Northern Army, the Hakkai Shubutai, were men of Hokkaido. They knew cold, they knew snow. But this was something else entirely. This was a malevolent spirit, a living entity of ice and mist. They called it the Ice Theater. The name was not official. It was a whisper in the intelligence reports of the U.S. Navy's Alaska sector, a phrase scrawled in the margin of a decoded message. Maybe by some young ensign from California, trying to make sense of the madness. Maybe by a grizzled commander who saw the perverse drama of it all. The Ice Theater. It fit. It fit perfectly. The stage was the island itself, a jagged volcanic hellscape pushed up from the bottom of the sea. There was no soil, only rock, sharp as broken glass and muskeg. A deceptive moss-covered swamp that looked solid but would swallow a man whole. It froze at night. It thawed during the day into a knee-deep slurry of freezing mud. Soldiers' boots, their puttees, their trousers were perpetually soaked. Frozen solid in the morning, a stinking wet mess by noon. They walked on a foundation of slush and treachery. Then there was the fog. The Williwaw. It was not weather, it was a presence. It descended without warning, a silent white wall that erased the world. Visibility dropped to 10 feet, 5 feet. The man in front of you became a ghost, the man behind you ceased to exist. It ate sounds, it ate landmarks, it ate entire platoons. A patrol of 20 men would walk into the mist. 5 would return, babbling about shapes, about echoes, about men who were there 1 second and gone the next, swallowed by the fog. Or the muskeg. No one ever knew. The cold was a liquid. It seeped through wool, through leather, through skin, and settled deep in the bone. It was not the crisp, clean cold of a Hokkaido winter. It was a damp, clinging, parasitic cold that never left. It made metal feel like burning acid. A rifle barrel, a canteen, a helmet. Touching bare metal meant losing a layer of skin. Instantly, Japanese POWs captured later would talk about this more than the battles. Not the Americans, the cold. The endless, wet, soul-crushing cold. They found it bewildering. They were prepared to die for the emperor. They were not prepared for their own bodies to betray them in such a slow, miserable fashion. It shattered all tactics. It mocked military doctrine. How do you aim artillery when you cannot see your target? The shells landed with a dull thud in the soft tundra, swallowed without an explosion. How do you coordinate a flanking maneuver when you cannot see your own flanks? It became a war of knives, of bayonets, of grenades thrown at phantom sounds in the mist. A war of ghosts. The Japanese, masters of the decisive charge, the Banzai, found themselves paralyzed. How do you charge a cloud? How do you fight a mountain that is actively trying to kill you? Survival became the only real strategy. Daily survival. The reports from American G2 intelligence noted the state of the Japanese dead. They weren't just killed by bullets, they were emaciated. Their feet were black, swollen masses from trench foot. Their diaries, later translated in a folder simply called A2 Personal, spoke of a surreal existence. Corporal Kenji Tanaka, a 21-year-old from Osaka, wrote of the silence. Then the screams. Then the silence again. He wrote of watching a comrade vanish into a patch of green ground. Just gone. He wrote of the constant wind, a sound like a woman weeping, a sound that drove men mad. Tanaka, Sato, Nakamura, Ito, Yamamoto, Kobayashi. They were all there, their names in a list, their fates sealed by the theater. In a declassified file in the National Archives, there is a sketch, drawn by an anonymous intelligence officer on the back of a map. It shows a frozen battlefield scene. It emphasizes the ice, the snow, the swirling fog. Silhouettes of soldiers are barely visible, hunched shapes leaning into the wind. They are not men. They are props on a stage. Lost in the ice, the snow, the fog. The caption is simple, written in pencil. The Ice Theater. It was a performance. A grand, cruel performance. The fog was the curtain, rising and falling without a stagehand's pull. The jagged peaks of Atu were the backdrop, painted in stark shades of gray and white. And the men, American and Japanese, were merely actors in a play they did not understand, their lines stolen by the wind. The Japanese soldiers were especially lost. They had been promised glory. They found absurdity. They found a frozen, indifferent hell that cared nothing for their courage or their emperor. They were bewildered, utterly bewildered. And so Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki made his decision, the final one. He gathered what was left of his command, 1,000 men, maybe less. Starving, freezing, haunted men. The final order was not a tactic. It was an act of desperation, an escape from the island itself. They would not die for the emperor huddled in a freezing foxhole, waiting for the fog to claim them. No, they would die running. They would die screaming. The curtain was about to rise on the final act of the Ice Theater. May 29th, 1943. Atu Island, Aleutian Islands. Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki knew the arithmetic of death. He had perhaps 1,000 able-bodied men left, maybe fewer. The Americans had over 15,000. He had a few clips of ammunition per soldier. The Americans had battleships that erased mountains. The math was simple. The math was final. An equation written in blood and ice. For 18 days, the island had been a meat grinder. A frozen, fog-shrouded meat grinder. The men of Major General Albert Brown's 7th Infantry Division, boys from sunny California and the Dry Plains, were told they were going to the desert. They landed in an Arctic swamp. Their leather boots, perfect for sand, rotted in the constant wet. They fought uphill, always uphill. Through places the maps would forever call Massacre Valley, Jarman Pass, Fish Hook Ridge. The names tasted of blood and exhaustion. Every frozen ridgeline cost hundreds of men. Every yard was paid for. Paid for in frostbitten feet and shattered bodies and minds that would never be whole again. The official reports called it attritional warfare. The soldiers called it hell. The fog was a constant enemy. A third army on the field, allied with no one. It hid Japanese machine gun nests. It swallowed American patrols whole. It made a mockery of command and control. A scribbled note from a Lieutenant Miller, 17th Infantry, found in a soggy notebook read simply, "We fired at sounds for 2 days. Lost 6 men. 6 men killed by ghosts in the mist." Guadalcanal was a hot, stinking jungle. A green hell, they whispered. This was a cold, silent purgatory, a white hell. The rumors from the South Pacific spoke of malaria, of giant insects, of ambushes and thick, suffocating vegetation. Here the enemy was the ground itself. the Willowa winds that came screaming down from the mountains, tearing tents to shreds, the insidious cold that seeped into your bones and never, ever left. American support was overwhelming. It was total. When the fog broke, even for a single blessed hour, the sky filled with the twin-tailed shapes of P-38 lightnings. Their cannons tore long, dark scars in the snow-covered tundra, chewing up everything in their path. Out in the bay, the immense gray silhouettes of the battleships, Pennsylvania and Idaho and Nevada, were permanent fixtures on the horizon. Their main guns spoke with a voice of thunder, a godlike voice that shook the mountains to their very core, an endless rolling earthquake of high explosives. Shells the size of small cars rained down on Japanese positions, day after day, a relentless, crushing weight of American steel and fire. The Japanese had nothing to answer with, nothing but rifles, a few dwindling mortar rounds, and a courage born of pure desperation. The final message from Colonel Yamasaki was intercepted at 0100 hours. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a request for terms. It was a declaration, a schedule. The radio operator who transcribed it said the Japanese signal was clear, precise, and devoid of emotion. The message stated a plan to assemble the remaining garrison, including the lightly wounded, to destroy all secret documents, all codes, all equipment, and then a final charge. He used the code word Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, a beautiful poetic name for mass suicide. He gathered what was left of his command near Chichagof Harbor. The walking wounded were given grenades instead of rifles. The severely wounded, those unable to move from their makeshift hospital caves, were given an overdose of morphine. A mercy, some called it later. The last act of a doomed army preparing for its apotheosis. Yamasaki burned the embroidered regimental flag, its silk turning to black ash in the freezing air. He read a final order. Then, armed with his family's gleaming samurai sword, he prepared to lead them into eternity. 3:30 in the morning. The silence was absolute. The kind of profound silence that only exists in a frozen wilderness just before dawn. A silence so deep it feels like pressure on your eardrums. Then a sound. A low, guttural murmur that grew into a roar. A human roar. It came out of the fog. It wasn't an attack. It was an apparition. 1,000 screaming men, maybe more, running straight at the American rear echelon. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were specters. Wraiths of vengeance boiling out of the mist. They hit the positions of the 50th Engineer Battalion. Men sleeping in their tents. Medics at an aid station. Clerks, cooks, drivers. Johnson, Williams, Chen, O'Malley, Rodriguez, Kowalski. They woke up from dreams of home to a living nightmare. If an artist had been there, crouched in a foxhole in that gray, spectral pre-dawn light, he would have sketched a vision from Dante's Inferno. A river of ghosts flowing uphill through the snow-filled trenches, ancient swords and modern bayonets flashing against the white canvas of the island. A tide of men determined not to win, but to die, to take as many of the enemy with them as they could. The scene was not a battle, it was an exorcism. A final, violent explosion of 18 days of pent-up fear, hunger, and fury. They swept over the first line with terrifying speed. They charged toward Engineer Hill, the location of the American artillery and a field hospital. The fighting was primitive. It was medieval, hand-to-hand. Bayonets, knives, sharpened entrenching tools, fists, teeth. A first sergeant from Iowa, a man who had seen combat in World War I, later wrote in a debriefing report, Folder 7A. They had a look in their eyes I'll never forget. They weren't looking at us. They were looking through us to somewhere else. They fought with a ferocity that stunned even the battle-hardened GIs, a ferocity that bordered on religious ecstasy. But madness is not a strategy. The American line, though broken and thrown into utter chaos, did not shatter completely. Pockets of resistance formed. Engineers and medics grabbed their rifles. Machine guns belatedly opened up from the flanks. The charge slowed, It faltered at the base of Engineer Hill, the wave breaking against a hastily formed wall of lead. Cornered, their ammunition gone, the Japanese soldiers did the last thing they were ordered to do. They pulled the pins on their Type 97 grenades, they held them to their chests, they held them to their heads. The sharp, popping sounds carried across the valley in the growing light. A final, grim punctuation to the slaughter. By sunrise, it was over. The snow on the slopes of Engineer Hill was stained a brilliant, sickening red. It was strewn with bodies, American bodies, Japanese bodies. The silence returned, heavier this time. Weighed down by what had happened. An American patrol found Colonel Yamasaki's body near the crest of the hill. He had been shot multiple times, but the final wound was from his own pistol. In his uniform pocket, they found a small, leather-bound diary. The final entry was not a battle plan. It was not a note of defiance. It was a poem. A haiku, its delicate lines a stark contrast to the carnage around him. The after-action report classified secret AR-A27ID stated that of an estimated 2,900 Japanese soldiers on the island, only 28 were captured alive. 28. Most of them were too severely wounded to take their own lives. The rest had been consumed by the battle, consumed by the island, or consumed by an order that offered only one path. The path to a shattered jewel. The investigation was officially closed, but for the men who survived Engineer Hill, the questions would never end. The ghosts would never leave the fog. And the screaming. The screaming would echo forever. August 15th, 1943. Kiska Island, Aleutian Islands. They came to kill an army. They brought a fleet to do it. 100 ships, American and Canadian, sliced through the slate-gray water, their hulls sweating in the perpetual Aleutian damp. Destroyers, cruisers, transports. 34,426 men were packed into their steel bellies. A joint U.S.-Canadian force, the largest yet assembled for a single Pacific amphibious operation. They carried rifles, mortars, flamethrowers, and the ghost of Atu. They remembered the reports, the fanatical resistance, the banzai charges, the fighting to the last man. They expected a butcher's bill. They were prepared to pay it in blood. The orders for Corporal Sam Hennessy of the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment were simple. Take the beach, take the ridge, kill anything that moves. He checked his rifle for the 10th time. The man next to him was sick over the side. Nobody spoke. The fog was a thick, cold blanket. A perfect day for a ghost story. The ramp slammed down. The first wave hit the water, then the black volcanic sand. Men fanned out, low and fast, their hearts hammering a violent rhythm against their ribs. They waited for the chatter of the Nambu machine guns, for the crack of the Arisaka rifles, for the whistle of incoming mortar rounds that everyone dreaded. They waited, and they waited. Nothing. Only the cry of the gulls and the relentless shushing of the surf on the shore. Silence. A deep, profound, suffocating silence that was more terrifying than any battle cry. Lieutenant Charles Egan, 24, a former history teacher from Dayton, Ohio, stared at the empty ridgeline through his binoculars. It was a perfect defensive position, a fortress of rock and tundra. It should have been spitting fire and death, but it was just a hill, empty. Icy beaches with his own troops advancing cautiously, a tableau of confusion against the oppressive gray sky. The whole thing was wrong. They moved inland, past derelict anti-aircraft guns pointing dumbly at the sky, past neatly dug trenches unoccupied. The tension did not break. It twisted, turning into a paranoid, creeping dread. Every gust of wind was a sniper, every shadow an ambush. They found the main Japanese barracks, empty. They found the mess halls. Bowls with traces of frozen food sat on the tables. They found a hospital ward, sterile, abandoned, with beds neatly made. It was as if 5,000 men had simply stood up and evaporated. Private First Class Antonio Gallo, a kid from Brooklyn, kicked open a door. Inside, a phonograph. A record of a Japanese folk song still on the turntable. A pack of cards splayed on a mat. A game unfinished. Calendars, letters from home, photographs of women in kimonos, a child's drawing, the small, intimate debris of human lives. Lives that were no longer there. It was a violation, a ghost town picked clean by a phantom wind. The rumors started as whispers. Then they grew louder, carried on the radio waves between ships and shore parties. He's not here. Nobody's here. The whole goddamn island is empty. The psychological shock was a physical blow. Men who had steeled themselves for a glorious, brutal fight now felt foolish, humiliated. They had brought a sledgehammer to smash a ghost. The massive naval bombardment that had preceded the landing, the days of relentless shelling from battleships like the Pennsylvania and Idaho, had pounded empty rock. 32,000 shells fired at nothing. The flyboys from the 11th Air Force had dropped tons of bombs on vacant hills. An orchestra of destruction playing to an empty house. For the Japanese, it was a masterpiece of deception, an operation codenamed KE. On July 29th, under the thickest cloak of fog, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura had done the impossible. He had sailed 2 light cruisers and 10 destroyers right under the nose of a massive American blockade. In 55 minutes, he had plucked all 5,183 men from the island. Not a man lost. Not a shot fired. A silent, perfect victory of retreat. And then the main thing started. The enemy they had come for was gone. But an enemy remained. It was the fog. It was suspicion. It was nerves stretched to the breaking point on an island of phantoms. On August 18th, the shooting began. A nervous American soldier on a patrol saw a shape moving in the mist. He fired. Someone fired back. Panic is a contagion. Men from the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment suddenly found themselves in a firefight. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Bullets whizzed through the thick, disorienting whiteness. Men screamed. Men fell. They were fighting shadows. They were fighting themselves. For hours, the battle raged across a barren stretch of the island. When the fog finally lifted, they saw the bodies. They were not Japanese. They were Canadians from the 13th Infantry Brigade. A mistake. A horrible, fatal mistake born of fear and confusion. The final tally was a quiet obscenity. 24 Americans dead. 4 Canadians dead. Another 50 wounded. The island of Kiska had claimed its casualties after all. The ghost had drawn blood without lifting a finger. The search continued, now a grim, pointless exercise in mapping an empty prison. They found a dog. A single shivering mongrel had been left behind. They found a pig. They found a few stray chickens. That was the extent of the enemy resistance. In the main command bunker, dug deep into the volcanic rock, Sergeant Bill Raskin found the last message. It wasn't an official document, no coded telegram, no scorched battle plan. It was a simple slate board leaning against a wall, the kind used for briefings. On it, someone had drawn in chalk, a caricature rendered with surprising skill. It showed a goofy, long-nosed American sailor, a Popeye figure, peering intently through a spyglass. But he was looking the wrong way, out to an empty sea. And just behind him, a tiny, grinning Japanese soldier was thumbing his nose before vanishing into a swirl of fog. Below the drawing was a single line of elegant, mocking script. No one in the platoon could read it, not then. But the meaning was clear enough. June 8, 1942. St. Paul Island, Pribilof Islands. The orders were not written for them to see. They were spoken. Spoken by men in uniforms they did not know. Men who did not know them. You have 1 hour. 1 bag per person. The USS Delaroff is waiting in the harbor. An Army transport ship. It was not a request. It was a fact. The war had arrived on their shores not with bombs, but with a command. They were citizens, American citizens. But the papers meant nothing. Their skin was the wrong shade. Their eyes held the wrong history. They were collateral. They were a problem to be managed. The Bureau of Indian Affairs official, a man named George Gasser, oversaw the process. He called it protective custody. Protection. They were being protected from their own homes. The Japanese were coming, they said. Maybe rumors. Whispers carried on the wind like the cries of gulls. So the villages were burned. Atka, Atu, St. Paul, St. George, the Orthodox churches with their onion domes torched. The houses built by grandfathers and great-grandfathers torched. The smoke blotted out the sun, a funeral pyre for a way of life. The official reason was to deny resources to the enemy, deny them shelter, deny them solace. It was a military decision, cold and clean. On board the Delaroff, there was no protection, only filth. 831 Aleut men, women, and children crammed into the ship's hold, a space designed for salmon, for coal, for cargo, not for people. The journey took days. Seasickness, dysentery, fear. A baby was born in the darkness. A life beginning as a world was ending. They were taken south, to Southeast Alaska, to places they had never heard of, places that would become their prisons. They called them duration villages, a name as sterile as a surgeon's knife. Funter Bay Cannery, Killisnoo, Burnett Inlet, Ward Lake. These were not villages. They were abandoned canneries, rotting mining camps. Places left to die now meant to hold a people. The buildings were dilapidated, drafty. Roofs leaked cold Alaskan rain onto dirt floors. There was no plumbing, no electricity, no running water. Just damp wood, rusted metal, and despair. The government's report, sealed for years, noted the conditions. The report stated, housing is crowded and lacks elementary sanitary facilities. Elementary, that's how it began. And then the dying started. Pneumonia, influenza, tuberculosis. The diseases moved through the crowded bunkhouses like a predator. 1 in 10. That was the number. 1 in every 10 Aleut evacuees died in the camps. They died far from the sea that had fed them, far from the land that held their ancestors. They died in protective custody. The names are in the records. Edeline, Lestenkopf, Krukov, Merkeljev, Zakharov, Galanin. Names on simple wooden crosses in makeshift graveyards. Forgotten casualties of a forgotten front. Meanwhile, another group of captives shivered in the Aleutian wind. The Japanese. The ones who survived the Banzai charge on Atu. The ones who didn't get the message on Kiska. They were prisoners of war. Young men like Corporal Nobuo Fujita. Barely 20, a farmer from Hokkaido. He had expected to die for the emperor on a desolate island. He had not expected to live. Not like this. They were taken to camps on Adak, on Amchitka, exposed to the same brutalizing weather that had killed their comrades. The willy wall. The wind that could tear a man from his feet. They looked out through the barbed wire at the gray sea, the gray sky, the gray land. This was the prize they had fought for. This unforgiving emptiness. They worked, digging ditches, building airfields, building the very bases that would launch bombers toward their homeland. The irony was as bitter as the wind. The resilience was a quiet thing, a stubborn root in frozen ground. In the duration camps, the Aleut women gathered beach grass. They wove baskets with ancient patterns, their fingers remembering what their minds tried to forget. They kept the language alive in whispers. They told the old stories to the children. Stories of the Unangaks, the people of the passes, who now had no passes to call their own. The soldiers, too, found their own ways to endure. A sketch exists, hidden in a veteran's footlocker for 50 years. On one leaf of paper, a charcoal drawing. 2 images, side by side. On the left, an Aleut mother with hollow eyes, her child wrapped in a tattered blanket, huddled inside a dark cannery. On the right, a GI, his face a mask of frost and exhaustion, peering over the rim of an icy foxhole. The artist's note on the back is barely legible. The same war. different cages. When the war ended, they were sent back, or what was left of them. They arrived to find nothing, ash, rubble. The foundations of their homes were overgrown with fireweed. The government offered them surplus army tents. Tents to replace a world. Sergei Sovorov, an elder from Atu, was held as a POW by the Japanese. He returned to find his people gone, his village a ghost. He was a man without a home, without a people. His story was one of many, lost in the archives. A folder marked Rehabilitation of Aleut Natives. Rehabilitation, another clean word. The trauma echoed for generations. The language faltered. The cultural knowledge severed. The elders who held the stories had died in the camps. The children who survived grew up with a hole in their memory. For decades, there was silence from Washington. A quiet, bureaucratic silence. The Aleutian Campaign was a victory, a footnote in the grand narrative of the Pacific War. The human cost was an inconvenience, a number in a classified report. Nobody knew, but the facts were there, buried. The testimony of a woman from St. Paul, given to a commission 40 years later, sits in a box in the National Archives. Her voice on a crackling cassette tape. They told us it was for our own good, she said. I thought, if this is good, I do not want to see what is bad. And then she stopped talking. The tape hiss fills the silence. A silence that has lasted for half a century. A silence that still hangs over the islands like the persistent Aleutian fog. June 4th, 1942. Akutan Island, territory of Alaska. A ghost fell from the sky. It did not burn, it did not explode. It simply stopped, its heart of metal and fire gone suddenly still, and tumbled onto the soft green tundra. A machine of impossible grace, now a broken toy on a forgotten island. Its pilot, Flight Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, was just 19 years old. His orders were clear. If his plane was damaged, land on the nearby island of Akutan. A submarine would be waiting. The briefing showed a flat, grassy plain, perfect for an emergency landing. The briefing was wrong. The grass was muskeg. A treacherous swamp hidden beneath a thin green skin. Koga's Mitsubishi A6M0, the legendary fighter that had swept the skies clear of enemies, flipped onto its back. The impact was not violent, just final. It snapped his neck. Cleanly. Instantly. And there his plane sat. Upside down, damaged, but almost entirely intact. A secret worth more than a battleship, guarded only by the dead pilot hanging in his cockpit straps. For a month, it waited. Waited in the endless Alaskan twilight. Then came the drone of another engine. An American engine. A U.S. Navy PBY Catalina on patrol, piloted by Lieutenant William Bill Thies, banked over the island. Below, against the green, he saw it. 2 red circles on the wings. The Hinomaru. The rising sun. Thies and his crew stared. They had all heard the stories. The whispers from Pearl Harbor, from the Philippines. Of a Japanese fighter that could not be beaten. A plane that could turn on a dime and climb like a rocket. They called it the Zero, a name spoken with fear in ready rooms across the Pacific. And now one was sitting right there, broken, vulnerable. The report was filed, marked urgent. A treasure had been found. Getting to the treasure was a nightmare. The Aleutians did not give up secrets easily. A recovery team, led by Lieutenant Robert Kermsey, arrived in early July. They were intelligence men, not salvage experts. They saw the prize. They felt its importance radiate from the cold metal. The first attempt to move it was a failure, a total failure. They brought tractors, heavy equipment. The tundra swallowed them. The machines sank into the muck, useless. The plane would not budge. Days passed. The fog rolled in. The Japanese could return. A single bomber could erase this opportunity forever. The tension was a physical thing, a knot in the stomach of every man on that island. They had to get it out. The second plan was simpler, smarter. They used native olet workers, hand winches, and improvised sleds. Inch by agonizing inch, they dragged the 2,500-kilogram fighter across the bog to a waiting barge. The operation took 5 days. 5 days of sweat and fear under a gray sky. On July 12th, the Zero was finally secured. It was hidden under tarps, loaded onto the USS St. Mihiel, and shipped south. Towards the sun, towards the men who would dissect its soul. North Island Naval Air Station, San Diego, California. The folder was called Project ZA. The plane was reassembled in a locked hangar. Engineers and test pilots swarmed it, men like Commander Eddie Sanders and Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thack. They were not just mechanics. They were battlefield coroners performing an autopsy on a myth. They measured every rivet. They tested every alloy. They ran the Sockeye 12 engine until it screamed. They found its secrets, all of them. The report was stark. It was a revelation. The Zero's performance came at a terrible cost. No armor plating for the pilot. None. No self-sealing fuel tanks. A few well-placed 50-caliber rounds would turn it into a torch. The airframe, built for lightness, could not withstand the stress of a high-speed dive. The ailerons would stiffen, making it slow to roll at speeds over 200 knots. And the carburetor. A simple float-type carburetor. A critical flaw. In a steep dive or a negative G pushover, the engine would choke. It would stall for just a second. But a second was a lifetime in a dogfight. The ghost was exposed. The myth was broken. This knowledge changed the war. It spread through the fleet like a vaccine. The new rules were simple, brutal, effective. Do not try to outturn a Zero. Ever. Do not try to outclimb a Zero. Use your strengths, your ruggedness, your speed in a dive. Attack from above. A high side pass. Fire a burst and keep going down. Let the Zero follow you into a dive it could not survive. The famous thatch weave tactic, where two American fighters could defend each other against a more nimble attacker, was perfected using this intelligence. Thousands of lives were saved. Thousands. All because a 19-year-old pilot mistook a swamp for a meadow. But the Zero was not the only lesson learned in the Northern Fog. The entire Aleutian campaign was a laboratory, a horrific, freezing, bloody laboratory for a new kind of war. The assault on Attu in May 1943 was the first full-scale American amphibious invasion of the war. The very first. It was a disaster. It was a triumph. It was both. For the first time, the sprawling, bickering branches of the American military were forced to fight as one. Army soldiers from the 7th Infantry Division, men trained in the California desert, shivered and died on snow-covered peaks. Navy battleships like the Pennsylvania and Idaho fired thousands of shells, learning the difficult art of shore bombardment in fog and uncertainty. The 11th Air Force, flying P-38 Lightnings and B-24 Liberators from crude, windswept airfields on Adak and Amchitka, tried to provide air support, battling weather that was a more constant enemy than the Japanese. They learned to talk to each other. On Attu, they learned through static-filled radios, through conflicting orders, through tragic mistakes. The lessons were written in blood in places called Massacre Valley and Holt's Bay. The official report, post-action synopsis, Aleutian Campaign, was a dry, bureaucratic document. But between the lines, it was a blueprint for victory. It detailed the failures in logistics, the desperate need for better landing craft, the critical importance of a single unified command structure. Every planner preparing for the great island-hopping campaigns across the Central Pacific read that report. The fumbles on Attu taught them how to land on Tarawa. The supply chain chaos in the Aleutians streamlined the invasions of Kwajalein and Eniwetok. The clumsy coordination of air and naval power in the North Pacific became a finely tuned orchestra of destruction at Saipan and Iwo Jima. The forgotten war was the rehearsal. The dress rehearsal for the main event. A pencil sketch survived the war. It is filed away in a dusty archive labeled Akutan Anomaly, June 1942. The drawing is simple, almost crude. It shows the elegant Japanese fighter, belly up in the muskeg, its red sun markings a jarring splash of color against the endless gray. It looks like a fallen bird, a dead thing. But it was not dead. It was waiting, waiting in the silence to tell its secrets to the enemy, and in doing so, to change the fate of the war that had just begun. What truly defeated the Emperor's soldiers on that frozen island? It was not the wind they called the Willy-Waw, the fist of God that could send a man flying into the churning sea. It was not the sight of 100 American ships slicing through the slate-gray water. The secret lingers in the vapor left by a ghost ship like the Ryujo. It echoes in the tales of 5 survivors, babbling about shapes and men who were there 1 second and gone the next. It hangs in the silence of a plane engine that simply stopped, its heart of metal and fire gone still above the soft green tundra. They came as warriors, promised a glorious death. They were met with something stranger. History records the battles. It does not record the breaking of a spirit. It does not record the moment belief itself dies. The truth remained somewhere else, between the lines of archival files, between the hollow eyes of an Aleut mother in a dark cannery, between the screen and the stare. The men of the 7th Infantry, boys from sunny California, brought more than guns to that perpetual damp. They brought a weapon for which there was no defense, not material abundance, an abundance of the incomprehensible. They brought the ice theater. And in that flickering light, the prisoners of war stared in disbelief. They did not see an enemy. They saw a mirror. A terrible, impossible mirror reflecting a world where their sacrifice was meaningless. Their sacred soil was just a frozen rock, and their war was a ghost story told by men who had already died. The greatest weapon was not a bomb. It was a question. And in that frozen theater, under the weight of that silent, crushing question, they could only stare. The war was over. Not on the battlefield, but behind their eyes,